I never thought a single day could change everything I had built. Yet here I was, staring at the ruined pieces of my life like a man watching a slow-motion car crash. The office smelled of coffee, fear, and the faint trace of betrayal. The air heavy, as if the building itself were suffocating me. I had spent years climbing the corporate ladder, believing that loyalty, hard work, and quiet perseverance would pay off. I was wrong, dead wrong. It all started when Mr. Caldwell, my so-called mentor and boss, walked into the room with that smirk that never reached his eyes. I had trusted him. I had thought he saw my dedication, my countless nights staying behind, my strategic solutions that saved the company millions. And yet, with a few words, he stripped everything away. "Ben," he said, "we've decided to go in a different direction. Your services are no longer needed." Just like that. No warning. No explanation beyond the usual corporate doublespeak. I laughed, not out of humor, but out of disbelief. The laughter that shook the walls of my tiny office cubicle was the kind that burns. I felt rage building inside me, a furnace that couldn't be extinguished. Every smile Caldwell had ever given me felt like a lie now. Every handshake, every pat on the back, every congratulatory email, it was all part of a game I didn't even realize I was playing. I left the office that day without looking back, but my mind was a whirlwind. I needed a plan, something so calculated that when it finally unfolded, it would leave no doubt that I had been wronged and that justice, my justice, had been served. I spent that night pacing my apartment, my hands shaking not from fear, but from anticipation. The city lights outside my window blurred as my mind raced through every possibility. By morning, I had made my decision. I would take everything from Caldwell, every ounce of power he had used to humiliate me. But I wouldn't do it recklessly. I would do it with precision. I started with research, poring over corporate records, financial statements, and emails that most people wouldn't even think to save. Every detail mattered. Every vulnerability was a tool. It wasn't just about revenge. It was about reclaiming control. For years, I had let myself be invisible, a shadow in the corner of conference rooms and board meetings. But no more. I would become the storm he never saw coming, a force that would dismantle everything he had built. The first strike came subtly. I leaked a minor but crucial report to a rival company. It was small, almost invisible, but the consequences were immediate. A single misstep on Caldwell's part, magnified by external scrutiny, and the cracks began to show. Emails flew back and forth. Executives whispered in corners, and the once unshakable empire started to falter. I watched from the sidelines, pretending to be a spectator, smiling behind my mask of normalcy. My colleagues didn't know, and Caldwell certainly had no idea who was orchestrating the unraveling of his carefully curated world. But I knew. I felt the satisfaction deep in my chest, a dark thrill that coursed through me every time a new piece of evidence confirmed the chaos I had sown. And then came the call. "Ben, can you come to my office? It's urgent." It was Caldwell's voice, usually commanding, now tinged with something that sounded like unease. I paused before answering, letting the silence stretch just long enough to plant doubt. When I finally spoke, my voice was calm, almost polite. "Of course, sir. On my way." As I walked to his office, I rehearsed every word I would say, every subtle look, every gesture that would unsettle him without revealing my hand. The hallway seemed longer than usual, each step echoing in my ears like a countdown. I opened the door, and there he was, standing behind his mahogany desk, a fortress of arrogance that now seemed a little less intimidating. "Ben," he said, forcing a smile, "we've had some setbacks. I need your expertise." The irony hit me like a punch. After throwing me out, now he wanted me back. I let the corner of my mouth twitch, pretending to consider his words carefully. "I'm always happy to help, sir," I said. But inside, I was already plotting the next move. That night, I sat in my apartment surrounded by documents, screenshots, and plans. Every small victory was a stepping stone toward the larger goal. Caldwell would not only lose the company's trust, but also the very power he wielded so arrogantly. I began to draft emails, set up fake accounts, and plant seeds of doubt among key stakeholders. Each move had to be perfect. There was no room for error. I remembered the nights I had sacrificed, the friendships I had neglected, the personal life I had abandoned, all in service to a company that spat me out without a second thought. And now, every effort I had put into mastering corporate politics, every quiet observation of my colleagues' weaknesses, would come to fruition. Days turned into weeks, and with each passing moment, my plans advanced. Minor errors turned into major crises. Investors questioned leadership. Competitors smelled opportunity. And through it all, Caldwell remained oblivious, blinded by his ego, convinced that the world was still in his control. Then came the moment that defined everything. I arranged a meeting between Caldwell and a so-called investor, someone I had cultivated through weeks of careful manipulation. The deal seemed golden, a lifeline that Caldwell desperately needed. But the documents he signed, the contracts he celebrated, were all traps. Every clause, every condition was designed to siphon power away from him, to dismantle his authority piece by piece. I watched from the shadows as he shook hands, laughing, unaware of the storm I had unleashed. The thrill of anticipation was electric, and I felt a dark satisfaction that was almost intoxicating. By the time he realized the betrayal, it would be too late. Everything he had built, every advantage he had, every ounce of influence, would crumble under the weight of meticulous planning and cold-blooded precision. That night, I couldn't sleep, not because I was worried, but because I was exhilarated. The path to revenge was clear, and every step brought me closer to the ultimate payoff. I imagined the look on Caldwell's face when the full extent of my actions became apparent. Fear, anger, disbelief, all mixed into a cocktail that I would savor from the comfort of my triumph. Revenge, I realized, was not about violence. It was about control, about turning every slight, every insult, every betrayal into a weapon. And I was armed, patient, and unstoppable. Caldwell had underestimated me, and that was his fatal mistake. The city outside my window shimmered with lights, oblivious to the battle unfolding within the walls of corporations and hearts alike. I knew the coming days would test me, challenge me, and push me to the edge. But I was ready. I had become something more than the man he thought he knew. I was the architect of his downfall, the invisible hand turning his empire into dust. And this was just the beginning. The thrill of the first phase of my plan was intoxicating, but I knew better than to savor it for too long. Caldwell had survived the first wave of chaos, blissfully unaware of who or what was orchestrating it. That ignorance was my weapon. While he slept comfortably in his penthouse, counting his so-called victories, I was awake, plotting the next strike, weaving a web so intricate that he wouldn't even know what hit him until it was too late. It began with his closest allies. I had spent countless nights poring over emails, texts, and private messages. I discovered secrets, alliances, weaknesses, all of which were now ammunition in my hands. Every trusted colleague, every confidant Caldwell relied upon, was about to become a pawn. I sent anonymous tips, planted false evidence, and subtly nudged their insecurities, creating friction that was invisible to an outsider but lethal in its effect. By a Monday morning, the office was a powder keg. I watched as whispers turned into hushed meetings and hushed meetings into arguments. Caldwell, always so composed, now paced his office, muttering to himself, the lines on his face deepening with stress. He blamed everyone except the invisible force dismantling his empire, and I smiled, letting the satisfaction warm me like fire. Next, I moved to financial sabotage. I had already leaked minor reports, but now it was time for something more sophisticated. Using the contacts I had quietly cultivated over the years, I orchestrated a series of small, almost undetectable transactions that diverted funds and created discrepancies in the company's accounts. The beauty of this move was subtlety. A single accountant would notice inconsistencies, but it would take weeks for management to trace them, and by then, the damage would be embedded. Then came the psychological warfare. I sent anonymous letters to Caldwell, carefully crafted threats that suggested knowledge of his deepest secrets. Nothing overt, just enough to unsettle him. At first, he ignored them, but soon, the fear became visible. I saw him glance over his shoulder in meetings, hesitate before signing documents, question even his own instincts. Every subtle doubt I planted multiplied, turning his mind into a labyrinth of paranoia. But I wasn't done. Revenge, I realized, needed a climax, a point of no return. I needed to create a situation so devastating that Caldwell would be forced to confront the consequences of underestimating me. That opportunity arrived faster than I expected. A major investor was planning a high-stakes meeting, a chance for Caldwell to secure funding that could stabilize his faltering empire. I positioned myself strategically. I manipulated schedules, rerouted communications, and introduced a chance leak that promised critical intelligence to a rival investor. The day of the meeting was electric. Caldwell arrived in his tailored suit, confidence radiating, oblivious to the disaster I had engineered. The investor, a man I had carefully courted, presented documentation that seemed legitimate, impeccably timed. Every number, every clause, every promise appeared flawless. But hidden within were the seeds of collapse. Contracts were binding, yes, but conditions meticulously designed to transfer control, restrict influence, and expose vulnerabilities Caldwell didn't even know existed. I watched from a discreet corner, my heart racing, a grin barely concealed. I felt the first wave of chaos as Caldwell's expression shifted, confidence cracking into confusion, confusion into panic. His voice faltered, questions hung in the air like daggers, and I knew the trap was closing. But the true art of revenge is unpredictability. I wasn't satisfied with merely destroying him financially. I wanted fear, embarrassment, and the slow burn of realization that he had been outmaneuvered at every turn. I began planting rumors, carefully curated stories that spread like wildfire through the industry grapevine. Caldwell's name, once synonymous with power, now carried whispers of incompetence, corruption, and mismanagement. Even his personal life was not spared. I found subtle ways to leak minor indiscretions to those close to him. Friends, family, colleagues. Nothing illegal, but enough to fracture trust and isolate him emotionally. I watched him crumble behind closed doors. The man who once held dominion over boardrooms, now second-guessing every relationship, every conversation, every decision. Then came the audacious move I had been waiting for, the public exposure. I compiled evidence of mismanagement, concealed agreements, and financial irregularities into a single dossier. It wasn't just proof, it was a weapon. I anonymously delivered it to key journalists and regulatory bodies, ensuring that when the story broke, it would hit every front page, every financial news outlet, every corporate feed. The fallout was immediate and brutal. Emails flooded in, calls came from all directions, and Caldwell's office transformed into a war room, the air thick with panic. Employees whispered, investors panicked, and the media painted a narrative of a leader who had lost control entirely. I watched the news unfold on my phone, heart pounding with a mixture of triumph and dark satisfaction. But I wasn't finished yet. I had learned that revenge is most satisfying when it is layered, multifaceted, and relentless. So I set my sights on the final, most devastating blow. I orchestrated a chance encounter between Caldwell and a former partner who harbored a deep grudge. Their confrontation, fully staged yet convincingly real, escalated in a way that left Caldwell humiliated and exposed. Witnesses saw the confrontation, rumors spread, and by the end of the day, Caldwell's credibility was shredded. That night, I allowed myself a rare moment of reflection. The city stretched below me, indifferent to the storm I had unleashed. I sipped my coffee, feeling the thrill of victory mingled with anticipation. Revenge, I realized, is an art, crafted, precise, and merciless. Caldwell had underestimated me, and now he was paying the price in ways he could not even comprehend. And yet, Even in the midst of triumph, I felt the hunger for more. Each move, each success, revealed further opportunities, deeper vulnerabilities. I was no longer just reacting to betrayal. I was dictating the game, controlling outcomes with a skill that bordered on obsession. The web I had woven was tightening, every thread pulling Caldwell closer to inevitable collapse. I was everywhere and nowhere, a shadow with a purpose, an architect of chaos whose blueprint was perfection. The coming days would be merciless. The final act of revenge was approaching, and when it unfolded, Caldwell would understand, in the most devastating way possible, the true cost of underestimating me. I leaned back in my chair, letting the adrenaline subside for a moment, but only for a moment. The game was far from over. Every whisper, every misstep, every tiny crack in Caldwell's empire was another chance to strike. I was patient, ruthless, and ready. And the storm I had begun would not just destroy Caldwell. It would redefine him, break him, and leave no doubt about who truly held power. This was no longer a game. This was war. The city slept, but I never did. Sleep had become a luxury I could no longer afford. Not while Caldwell's empire was still breathing. I could feel the tremors of fear pulsing through the corridors of his office, the subtle unease that my invisible hand had planted beginning to blossom into panic. Every decision he made now carried the weight of uncertainty. Every glance over his shoulder a testament to the shadows creeping into his life. I had to escalate. The subtle strikes had served their purpose. They weakened him, eroded his confidence, and exposed his vulnerabilities. But subtlety alone would not satisfy the hunger that had grown inside me, a hunger for complete domination, for vengeance so thorough that it would leave nothing of the man who had humiliated me. It began with personal stakes. I had spent weeks observing him, mapping his routines, cataloging relationships, and identifying the smallest fissures in his armor. I knew his fears, his insecurities, the moments he had believed were private. These details were now my arsenal. I began crafting scenarios that would manipulate his reality, forcing him to question not just his decisions, but his perception of the world around him. The first move was public humiliation, subtle yet devastating. I leaked a confidential memo to the media, one that suggested internal corruption and favoritism at the highest levels. The memo was anonymous, seemingly originating from within the company itself. Social media exploded. Headlines questioned Caldwell's integrity. Analysts debated his competence. Investors called emergency meetings. I watched as his carefully curated reputation began to crumble, feeling a pulse of dark satisfaction surge through me. Then I struck where it hurt the most, his relationships. I reached out to those closest to him, not with lies, but with truths twisted into uncomfortable narratives. Friends, partners, and family members began to question his intentions, suspect his motives, and doubt his loyalty. Isolation crept in like a shadow, invisible but suffocating. Caldwell, once the master of all he surveyed, was now uncertain of whom he could trust. The corporate battlefield was next. I unleashed a flurry of strategic attacks on his projects. Minor errors, unnoticed by the untrained eye, were magnified, documented, and presented as systemic failures. Colleagues who had once admired him turned skeptical, questioning his judgment in boardrooms and strategy meetings. Every carefully constructed decision he made now became fodder for doubt and criticism. But the most satisfying move was the infiltration of his inner circle. I had cultivated allies in silence, individuals loyal not to Caldwell, but to opportunity. I orchestrated situations where his trusted advisors began to betray him subtly. Misplaced memos, miscommunicated instructions, delayed reports. Caldwell's frustration mounted as he confronted errors and failures, unaware that I was orchestrating the chaos from behind the scenes. The psychological toll was immense. I began sending anonymous messages, small reminders that he was being watched, that his empire was no longer his alone. Notes appeared on his desk, emails with cryptic subject lines, calls from numbers that vanished before he could answer. I saw him flinch at shadows, hesitate before decisions, question his instincts. Fear, I realized, was the ultimate weapon, and I wielded it with precision. Then came the audacious move that would escalate the war. I manipulated a key acquisition deal, convincing Caldwell that a critical partner was loyal while secretly undermining the alliance. When the meeting took place, the partner exposed inconsistencies, creating a scandal that reverberated across the industry. Investors panicked, clients doubted, and Caldwell's confidence shattered under the weight of a crisis he could not control. I observed it all from a distance, savoring the chaos like a fine wine. The thrill was addictive. Every misstep he took, every moment of doubt, every public embarrassment was a confirmation of my dominance. But I didn't stop there. I needed more than chaos. I needed annihilation. The next phase was infiltration into his personal life. I uncovered hidden secrets, indiscretions that had never reached the public eye. With careful precision, I leaked these details to those who mattered most to him, ensuring that betrayal and heartbreak compounded his professional downfall. By the end of the week, Caldwell was isolated, humiliated, and vulnerable, exactly where I wanted him. I set the stage for the final confrontation, a meticulously orchestrated showdown that would leave him exposed and powerless. I arranged for him to attend a high-profile industry gala, a perfect venue where influence and reputation were everything. Unbeknownst to him, every key figure present had been subtly influenced, prepped to witness and participate in the unraveling of his carefully constructed persona. The night arrived, glittering chandeliers reflecting the grandeur of the event, laughter masking the undercurrents of tension. Caldwell entered, exuding confidence, unaware that the trap had been set with surgical precision. I mingled in shadows, observing every expression, every gesture, every flicker of doubt that crossed his face. I triggered the first strike subtly, a whispered comment here, a misleading email there, a planted document suggesting incompetence and betrayal. The reactions were immediate. Conversations faltered, alliances shifted, and Caldwell's confidence began to fracture in real time. He tried to regain control, but every move he made only deepened the perception of instability. Then I delivered the coup de grace. A staged confrontation with a former partner, fueled by carefully leaked documents and manipulated evidence, erupted in front of key witnesses. Caldwell's composure shattered. His voice wavered, accusations flew, and for the first time, he looked helpless. Cameras captured every moment, social media amplified the spectacle, and within hours, the industry had a new narrative. Caldwell, once untouchable, was exposed as weak, fallible, and defeated. The thrill of the moment was indescribable. I felt a dark ecstasy as I watched him crumble under the weight of his own misjudgments, manipulated at every turn by the invisible force of my design. Every detail, every preparation, every sleepless night had culminated in this moment of absolute control. Even then, I did not pause. Revenge, I realized, was an endless dance of opportunity and precision. I monitored every reaction, every news report, every social media post, ensuring that Caldwell's fall was comprehensive and irreversible. By the time he understood the magnitude of what had occurred, it would be too late. As I walked home under the city lights, the world oblivious to the storm I had unleashed, I felt the pulse of power surging through me. Revenge was no longer a concept. It was an art, and I had become a master. Caldwell had underestimated me at every turn, and now he was paying the ultimate price. I had set the flames of retribution, and they were consuming everything he had once held dear. The path ahead promised further chaos, more calculated strikes, and the eventual total annihilation of the man who had once thought he could destroy me. And this time, there would be no mercy. I had watched him crumble from the shadows, a predator savoring the slow unraveling of his carefully constructed life. But the subtle manipulations, the public humiliations, and the financial sabotage were just the prelude. If Caldwell thought he had endured the worst, he had no idea what was coming. I needed fire, chaos, and pain, personal, unmistakable, and absolute. The first strike of the night was intimate, precise, and merciless. I infiltrated his inner circle, those closest to him, not just to manipulate, but to betray. Friends and confidants who once whispered loyalty were now conduits for lies, misinformation, and panic. I orchestrated meetings where private secrets spilled, conversations were twisted, and trust evaporated. Every glance he gave was now heavy with suspicion, every word from those around him a potential dagger. The isolation I had cultivated now became suffocating. Meanwhile, I began targeting his professional reputation directly. I had learned the weaknesses of his investors, the rumors that could ignite panic, and the small missteps that could snowball into catastrophe. I exploited every vulnerability, sending reports that suggested massive fraud, errors that were exaggerated into systemic collapse, and insider whispers that painted him as reckless and incompetent. The company, once his fortress, trembled under the weight of orchestrated chaos. But it wasn't enough to simply destroy him from afar. I needed him to feel the consequences personally, to witness the collapse as it engulfed his world. I arranged for a high-profile gala, ostensibly a celebration of company success. He walked in, confident, radiant, unaware of the trap I had laid. Guests smiled and chatted, unaware that every interaction, every handshake, every conversation was carefully orchestrated to ensnare him. The first wave hit subtly. Whispers, exchanged glances, and strategically leaked documents created uncertainty and doubt. Investors questioned his decisions, partners hesitated, and colleagues avoided his gaze. I watched from the corner, savoring every flicker of panic, every forced smile, every stammer in his voice. The man who once commanded the room now struggled to navigate its treacherous currents. Then came the personal strike, the one that would leave scars he could never hide. I had discovered indiscretions, minor, hidden, but damning when revealed strategically. I leaked them to his family, his closest allies, and the media. The reactions were instantaneous. Anger, shock, heartbreak. He confronted people he trusted, only to discover betrayal at every turn. The isolation was complete, suffocating, and he had no one to turn to but himself. The corporate world followed the personal. I orchestrated a series of accidents in key projects. Deals fell through, data vanished, deadlines were missed. Caldwell's reputation deteriorated as the press, investors, and competitors scrutinized every misstep. Board meetings became battlegrounds, where colleagues who once feared him now openly challenged decisions. He was a king without subjects, a general without soldiers. The climax approached. I arranged a meeting with a major competitor, a man whose ambition was matched only by his ruthlessness. Caldwell believed he was negotiating a merger, a lifeline to salvage his empire. What he didn't know was that every term, every clause, every handshake was orchestrated to strip power away, leaving him exposed and defenseless. The competitor played his part perfectly, pressing on vulnerabilities I had meticulously highlighted. By the time Caldwell realized the trap, it was too late. But the apex of revenge was still to come. I orchestrated a confrontation that would leave him humiliated, broken, and fearful. I planted evidence suggesting betrayal within his closest team, ensuring a dramatic confrontation during a high-stakes board meeting. Documents were revealed, accusations flew, voices rose, and the man who once exuded control now fumbled, stammered, and collapsed under scrutiny. Cameras caught every moment, social media amplified it, and within hours, Caldwell's reputation was shattered beyond repair. Even as he fought, desperate and enraged, I watched with detached exhilaration. Each reaction, each falter, each misstep confirmed my meticulous planning and relentless precision. I had become the unseen hand of chaos, a force that could dismantle both personal and professional lives with ruthless efficiency. But there was one final act, the one that would seal the inferno. I orchestrated a complete isolation. Friends turned against him, colleagues feared him, partners abandoned him, and the media scrutinized his every move. The man who once held power now had no allies, no protection, and no path to redemption. Fear, humiliation, and despair consumed him as he realized the scope of my vengeance. By the time I allowed myself a pause, Caldwell was a shadow of his former self. The company he built, the respect he commanded, the influence he wielded, all evaporated into chaos and ruin. And I, standing in the quiet aftermath, felt the dark thrill of total victory. Revenge was no longer abstract. It was complete, visceral, and undeniable. Yet, even in the silence, I felt the hunger for more. The storm I had unleashed was only partially spent. Opportunities remained, vulnerabilities exposed, and the taste of ultimate control lingered on my tongue. I had become more than a man scorned. I was an architect of destruction, a maestro conducting the symphony of his ruin. The city lights outside my window shimmered, as if celebrating in quiet complicity. Caldwell, defeated, humiliated, and isolated, was now a cautionary tale whispered in boardrooms and social gatherings. I, however, remained invisible, the unseen force whose vision, patience, and cruelty had rewritten the course of a man's life. And I knew, deep in my soul, that the final chapter, the last act of annihilation, was yet to come. The inferno I had ignited would not just consume Caldwell. It would leave no trace of the man who dared to betray me. And when that final moment arrived, there would be no mercy, no escape, and no turning back. The air was thick with anticipation, heavy as smoke before a storm. I could feel it vibrating in my chest, the culmination of months of planning, manipulation, and unrelenting strategy. Caldwell had fallen, his empire teetering, his reputation shredded, his closest allies turning their backs. Yet he still lived, still struggled to piece together the ruins of his world. That would change tonight. I had orchestrated every step with precision. Every leak, every rumor, every minor betrayal had been leading to this moment. I had built a labyrinth of chaos so intricate that the man who once believed himself untouchable now had no map, no compass, no hope of escape. He was a puppet dangling by invisible strings, and I held the scissors. The venue was perfect, a private executive retreat, isolated from the city, a place where influence, power, and secrets mingled in one perfect storm. I arrived early, unseen, blending into the shadows, ensuring that every detail, every participant, every element of the night would work in my favor. My pulse raced, but I remained calm, focused, ruthless. Caldwell entered, radiating arrogance and misplaced confidence. He believed he could salvage something, anything, from the chaos I had engineered. He smiled, shaking hands, making jokes, projecting charm. But beneath that veneer, I could see it, the slightest tremor, the flicker of doubt, the shadow of fear I had planted months ago. The first act was subtle but devastating. I triggered a sequence of events, each designed to isolate him further. Critical documents disappeared from his briefcase. His notes were tampered with. Private messages were intercepted and distorted, reaching his partners and investors at precisely the right moment. His foundation, meticulously built over decades, began to shake. Then came the confrontation. I had arranged for key figures, former allies, competitors, investors, to confront him with evidence of betrayal, corruption, and incompetence. The room turned into a battlefield of accusations, with Caldwell at the center, struggling to defend himself. His voice faltered, arguments collapsed, and the facade of control crumbled like dry sand. I watched, detached but exhilarated, as panic replaced poise, confusion replaced strategy, and fear replaced confidence. But the true masterpiece was personal. I had discovered a secret he had buried deep, a flaw no one else knew. With surgical precision, I revealed it to those he trusted most, ensuring that his world of relationships collapsed in parallel with his professional empire. Friends and confidants recoiled, partners questioned loyalty, family felt betrayal. The isolation I had orchestrated became absolute. By the time the evening ended, Caldwell was broken, visibly, irreversibly, utterly. He stumbled through his retreat, a king dethroned, a man stripped of power, dignity, and control. Cameras captured moments of his despair. Whispers spread through the industry like wildfire. Within hours, news outlets painted him as a cautionary tale, a cautionary monument to hubris and underestimation. I felt a dark satisfaction, one that was both electric and consuming. Every plan, every sleepless night, every calculated move had led to this. The man who had once thrown me aside, who had underestimated me, who had believed himself untouchable, now lay in the ashes of his own making. And I, patient, meticulous, and merciless, had built the fire that reduced him to ruin. Yet even in triumph, I understood that revenge is not merely destruction, it is transformation. I had changed as much as he had fallen. Patience, observation, manipulation, and precision had honed me into someone unrecognizable from the man who had once been wronged. The storm I had created was both his undoing and my rebirth. The night ended with silence. The city outside was indifferent, but I felt the resonance of power and victory deep within. Caldwell's world had collapsed entirely, his influence nullified, his reputation destroyed, his relationships shattered. He would never recover, never regain what he had lost. And I, standing in the shadows, was finally free. Free of betrayal, free of fear, free of the chains he had once imposed. I walked away from the retreat, each step deliberate, each breath measured. There was no celebration, no outward display of triumph. Only the quiet, unshakable knowledge that I had executed justice on my terms. Revenge had been exacted in its purest, most ruthless form, and the lesson was absolute. Underestimate me, and you pay the ultimate price. And as I disappeared into the night, leaving behind the wreckage of a man who thought himself untouchable, I realized something profound. The fire I had ignited did not merely consume, it illuminated. It revealed the depths of patience, the power of strategy, and the inevitability of justice when wielded with skill, focus, and relentless determination. Caldwell was finished. I was victorious. And in that victory, I found not just satisfaction, but a terrifying, intoxicating affirmation. The man who had wronged me was gone, and in his place, a new force had emerged, calculated, unstoppable, and unrelenting. The final reckoning was complete. The storm had passed, the flames had consumed everything, and the world would never forget the cost of betrayal. I had won, completely.